Welcome to the CultureLab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
How do you begin to breathe life, and we speak to this in the book, back into your culture in a way that makes it real and tangible and relevant to your business and your employees? Because how they connect to those values are imperative in their ability to practice and embody the behaviors that come with those values on a day-to-day basis. So we believe that part of the challenge is simply has been, if you treat those values in a very flat, stagnant, almost marketized way in your business versus being a framework by which everyone is supposed to show up and engage and make decisions every day, then you already lose momentum in your ability to truly impact that company culture.
Hello, and welcome to episode 85 of the CultureLab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrain, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrain community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.1/culturebrain. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. Today, my guest is Dr. Donte Vaughn. He's one of the authors of a book called From Culture to Culture. He's also a co-founder of CultureWorks, a company that helps leaders cultivate a healthy culture based on their company's values, and to do it in real time. So we talk about whether it's possible to implement a system that allows organizations to manage their culture, because culture seems to be so intangible and so organic. And we also talk about how to breathe life into your culture playbook, and whether it's possible to do it in a way that makes your purpose and your values real and tangible through daily practices, behaviors, but also systems and processes. So tune into this episode if you are interested in how you can take a proactive approach to evolving your culture and turning it into something that actually works for your business and for your people.
My name is Dr. Donte Vaughn. I am the Chief Executive Officer for a company based in Atlanta, Georgia called CultureWorks, where we specialize in solutions for business leaders looking to define, implement, measure, and improve their company culture.
Sounds like our listeners, so I'm delighted to dive deeper into your work. But before we go there, there's one question that I ask all of our guests, and it's, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? How did you grow up?
A great question. For me, I grew up as a young man in the city of Philadelphia. I was shaped by my upbringing, raised by a single mother for a part of my life, and navigating public school system and challenges that came with that, and really being pulled in different directions, in terms of our cultural environment. We are a multi-ethnic family, having exposure to different racial groups, and then of course
Hmm.
our upbringing. Growing up in the urban community, you could be pulled in down a negative path or a positive path. And for
Yeah.
me, I was always interested in learning and in academics, and I balanced that with sports. So I always found myself
Hmm.
playing in different crowds. I was more like Switzerland when it came to cultural influences, right? And I believe that's really what shaped my interest in just understanding how individuals come together and how they interact and what makes them effective or ineffective in those interactions. And I
Mm.
think that started just as a kid, just navigating my environment, trying to stay out in trouble, trying to navigate the right path in my life and balance all those unique dynamics that were around me.
I find it so fascinating because we obviously grew up in really different ways. I grew up behind the Iron Curtain in communist Poland. But interestingly, this was also my way to sort of shape and create my own environment and my family's as well, because it was a pretty oppressive sort of environment and definitely quite easy to get yourself into trouble as well, just like
Yeah.
for you in your environment. And so I've noticed that for many of my family members, the way they dealt with that situation was really immersing themselves in either learning. So we had a lot of teachers in our family or in sports. So,
Yes, right.
just like you, right? It's either the academic path or in sports. And it's funny because when I ask this question to so many different people, and very often I get similar responses, I find this fascinating. So you said that this sort of made you feel interested how individuals behave when they come together in different groups. But I suppose that as a kid growing up in that environment, you didn't have a dream of becoming a culture consultant. So, I mean, what was the path there? How did you get to where you are today professionally?
So when I started my academic journey, I knew I had this interest in business as an outlet. I knew that I was a mediocre athlete at best. And so I knew I wasn't going to travel the athletic path. I had some gifts in terms of interpersonal skills and communication. And you're always told growing up that, you're going to be an attorney or
Mm.
you're going to be a doctor or you're going to be a police officer. Those were the idolized career paths, especially in our community. And I didn't connect necessarily with the medical field. I knew I didn't want to be a politician. So it's like, well, which way do I go? Well, business seems to make sense. I mean, the positive role models I did have in my life seem to be in this realm of business. I started out focusing on business administration, and I knew something was missing because my passion and interest in understanding the connection of people, I didn't get enough of that. So I
Right.
pivoted from business administration to business management. I remember having
Hmm.
conversations with academic advisors saying, hey, well, if you want to be more people focused or people centric, then you want to focus on the management side of business or the
Hmm.
human capital management side of business. So I pivoted and began the academic journey and earned my bachelor's in business management. And that opened up my eyes to leadership theory. And it's like, oh, okay, this is more interesting to me in terms of understanding the role of leadership and how those engagements, those interactions, their decision making informs how well people are able to operate together. So that's why I continued at a master's level studying the realm of leadership theory, organizational leadership best practices, that type of thing. And then it just took off from there, and eventually went down the academic journey of obtaining my doctoral degree with a concentration in organizational leadership and culture. And culture really has been a hot topic, even in academia, only in the past maybe 15 years or so. Wasn't necessarily something that was a focal point through a curricula. It was something that people were still getting their hands around. So I found that fascinating and something I wanted to be a part of exploring.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I'm a total culture geek myself, but my path to this field was really different because my friends and I, we founded a company, and that company turned out to be incredibly successful commercially, but an utter disaster when it comes to company culture. And so for me, I came to this field out of necessity because I understood that if we didn't figure it out, we couldn't grow in a sustainable way. And so I started researching this topic, and then I did my master's in strategic human resources management, and then dived even deeper. So really went down this rabbit hole. But yeah, we approached this topic from different paths, but I think with the same passion. And so, I love chatting to a fellow culture geek because
Absolutely.
these conversations are so fascinating. And your book, From Culture to Culture, has definitely raised many questions for me. And I'm really sensing that we will have some good creative intellectual friction in our conversation today, which is always a great recipe for a fun interview. So let's get going. The first question that
Awesome.
I have about your book is, what is the origin story? Because I totally agree that culture hasn't been in the central focus of our attention for a very long time. But for the past decade or so, many books about culture have been written. So I'm sure that you had a very good reason to, devote so much time and so much energy to writing a book on this topic. Why? Why this book? Why now?
So my partner and I really were focused in heavily around our solution in helping organizations improve their organizational dynamics and how they operated as a business to realize some performance improvement outcomes. That's where we sort of started our focus, and we put a lot of emphasis around leadership behavior as part of that process. You can have the greatest systems, greatest processes in your business, but if you don't address leadership behavior and how individuals engage, interact, and make decisions every day, then you're not going to be able to fully optimize your potential as an organization, which led us to really examining this conversation around company culture. And what we found is, like you said, over the last decade or so, many books have been written specific to company culture and ways in which organizational leaders may approach it or attempt to understand it, and even to the extent of trying to improve it. And what we saw, both in text format, but also in our experiences with our client partners, the missing piece to this is taking a proactive, systematic approach to understanding how to truly impact company culture at the heartbeat of culture, which for us is those engagements, those interactions, and decision making that occur in real time. And we realize what's missing is that system. There's no articulation of an approach that business leaders can take to actually impact company culture in a tangible and sustainable way versus what we found was primarily reactionary methods, such as
Yeah.
an evaluation of employee experience to then get a gauge on culture and then try to react to that feedback. And we said, wait a minute, oftentimes that's too late. And in
Mm-hmm.
the last year or so, we found this increase in, a mass exodus of employees, difficulty in attracting and retaining talent, all these challenges that our partners were presenting. And we said, now is the time to articulate this in a text format, take what we've been doing for the past few years and formalize it in a way that other business leaders can actually begin to apply it.
Yeah, I love that. And I definitely want to double click on this whole notion around becoming proactive about your
Yes.
culture, because I think that's incredibly important. And I have to say that, I see something similar to what you have seen around me. So there's definitely this reactive mode that a lot of organizations are in at the moment, where they start seeing problems. And this is the moment when they say, hey, maybe we should do something about it and start thinking about fixing their organizational culture. So you are suggesting that there is a way to take a more proactive approach to your company culture. So I want us to dive a little deeper into that. Can you speak to what it means in practical terms to be proactive about your culture, and what have we been doing wrong so far and have been unable really to be intentional and prevent some of the problems that we now see around us from happening?
So when I think of this notion of being intentional, to your point, or proactive about company culture, it means starting all the way at the origin or the foundation of your company culture, which for us is defined by an organization's core values. And oftentimes, core values are established through good intent to market or educate the marketplace or even your talent around the values by which you believe everyone should embody in order to drive success for your business. And oftentimes, once they've been relatively defined and communicated, the work has stopped there. And then it becomes more of a desire for it to organically evolve in an organization. And we see that as part of the challenge that organizations have experienced because oftentimes those values and those definitions and things have become stagnant. We call it window dressing oftentimes. You could blow the dust off the picture frames that are hanging in the conference room, so to speak, right? And
Yeah.
so part of it is how do you begin to breathe life? And we speak to this in the book back into your culture in a way that makes it
Mhm.
real and tangible and relevant to your business and your employees, because how they connect to those values are imperative in their ability to practice and embody the behaviors that come with those values on a day-to-day basis. So we believe that part of the challenge is simply has been if you treat those values in a very flat, stagnant, almost marketized way in your
Mhm.
business versus being a framework by which everyone is supposed to show up and engage and make decisions every day, then you already lose momentum in your ability to truly impact that company culture. I mean, it's sort of like planting seeds in a pot of dirt or in a garden. You may label the seeds, but then you just kind of walk away and hope that the garden grows to the extent and in the manner and you can leverage the fruits of that effort. But the problem with that is what happened to tilling the ground, nurturing the seeds, ensuring that they're growing up properly, ensuring that things aren't growing into one another, ensuring that as the fruit ripens, you can pick it and show everyone the value or the outcome of these seeds and what happens to that process versus allowing it to grow organically. Sometimes it can grow out beyond what you wanted it to. It can begin to impede on one another. And we see that in business and in culture. We have a multitude of subcultures that have been created. You have different definitions for what your values were originally meant to mean in the business. These things happen because of that stagnation. So we always start at understanding and defining your value system and being clear about how this then connects to how you operate every day. And then the next step in that, of course, is to make clear where those engagement and interaction points are in your business and begin to make it very defined in terms of leadership behavior, how leaders should be engaging and interacting every day. And that's where the next gap we typically see in organizations beyond just the stagnation of the values or lack of definition. It's okay, now that you've defined these values and you've declared them to mean these things to your business, are they practical? Have you articulated them in a way that says, as a frontline leader in my business, this is what it means to show up and be accountable or to be trusting or to show integrity, and making it very granular to that frontline leader so that they understand that these are the behaviors I should be embodying every day. So at the start of my shift and during my meetings and when I'm making decisions, this is what's required. And you have to do that similar to how you would do any standard operating procedure or process in your business. What do we do when a new leader is hired on? We onboard them, we train them, we provide them with a framework, we give them standard operating procedures, and we let them know the positive impact or the negative impact for not following that procedure. The same thing needs to happen with your values that you've ascribed for your business. And that's another fundamental disconnect that we've abridged with our culture performance management methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to circle back to the word that you've used, that organic, right? Organic way of approaching culture is not really the best approach. It's way more effective to be intentional about it. And as you said, make things incredibly clear for everyone so that they know what exactly is expected, what exactly is rewarded within this organization, and what it really means, as you say, in day-to-day life and collaboration with their colleagues. And one of the questions that arises for me here is, and I'm sure that you are aware that some people feel that actually the organic way might be the best way for a culture to evolve, and perhaps even the only way for a company culture to grow and evolve. And there are people like, Professor Brian Walker, Sarah Saul from Stanford, or Dr. Leandro Herrero, who have done a lot of work in this field and who present some compelling evidence that culture needs to be a movement, not a mandate. And you are a proponent of a managed culture. So let's dive deeper into that. What does culture management system really mean? And give us your definition of what a managed culture really is and why it's better, in your view, to prescribe these behaviors for employees rather than allow them to define it for themselves and be a part of this process of defining what our values mean and how they should be lived by everyone in the organization.
I love this topic and this debate in our field, Aga, because I believe it's rooted in how we define company culture and how we distinguish the difference between company culture as a framework for how individuals joining an organization should show up, engage, interact, and drive results for a business versus leadership style.
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe that what should be organic or natural to the leader is their style, right? Their disposition, how they show up and through their interpersonal skills, how they shift their leadership style based on the individual with whom they're communicating with. All those nuances should be relatively unique to the leader and what makes them effective. What we're speaking to is when we talk about company culture, we're talking about the values we share, the language we use, the behaviors we display, and the connections we have with one another, right? Those values set the standard for how everyone must engage and interact. As a new leader joining my organization, you don't get to come in to my organization and think that the way you engage and interact with individuals necessarily should be the best practice, because as the senior most leaders of my organization, I know what has led or what will lead to our success. So I need to give you a framework, because you could have come from an organization who had a toxic culture, or how you've been taught or reinforced how you should engage and interact made sense for that industry or for that business, but not for ours, right? So I need to give you a framework by which you should engage and interact. When you think about culture and our existence outside of the workplace, when you bring a child into this world, I'm not telling you that as a child or as a new member of the family, you don't have your own self-identity. But what I am saying is these are the values by which have led to our family's stability and success. And we have an expectation for you to uphold these values. Similarly, in an organization, that same principle applies. So the values set the standard for how individuals must engage and interact. Now, the definition of those values determines the behaviors individuals should exhibit within that company culture. So now that I tell you my standards, I have to be able to say, well, here's what this looks like. So you know how to identify or make connection to these values. Now, once we all understand that, the definition of the values and the behaviors, now we all have a common language by which we all can navigate this culture. And with that common language, now we can practice these behaviors in terms of establishing how individuals engage and interact within that company culture. It doesn't stifle you from still applying your own style as a leader, because that's going to be unique to you. but it does give you some guidelines by which you show up in this business. If we want to be able to grow and scale this business and invite new leaders into it, we need to make sure we give them a framework by which they do so. And that's what we mean by managing company culture starts with those clear definitions and expectations. But then now we have to hold people accountable when they don't actually exhibit the behaviors that we believe embody our culture. Something has to happen. There's a saying that you may have heard: you promote what you permit. So if you have a leader who is exhibiting negative behavior or behaviors that don't align with your company culture, is that because you've allowed it to just organically evolve in the way that some practitioners argue it should be? But yet, is that okay to have implications on the organization at large that impacts hundreds or thousands of employees at a time? So we believe that, yes, you have to manage it, which means you have to measure it. You have to react to the positive behaviors and the negative ones. You have to create opportunities for individuals to have self-reflect as well as receive feedback, and then give them the tools and resources to develop around those behaviors, because it's not always natural for a leader to behave a certain way that aligns with your culture. Because again, they could have come from a family or from an organization who defined that value very different for them, right? And we believe that it's imperative to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that we can all agree that clarity is kindness. So I think as human beings, we do have this deep need for clarity. And so I can absolutely see how important that is to actually flesh out what these behaviors look like in practice, on the ground, in a specific role. I guess where someone could still challenge that is this assumption that sometimes can be dangerous, that senior leaders know what behaviors are the behaviors that drive towards success and that entirely align with values as the organization defines them. We all know, I'm sure that you are familiar with the research and evidence as much as our listeners, that a study after study shows that leaders often have huge blind spots. So very often they are detached from the rest of the organization. They typically perceive their culture to be more positive than the rest of the organization. And so how would you speak to that concern? Because if these are the people who you believe should be defining these behaviors, and yet they do have these huge blind spots, aren't we setting ourselves up for failure? Aren't those values going to be disconnected from what makes the organization effective?
Yeah, that's a fair point, and one that we address in our practice. Now, the easy answer is that's why you hire educated practitioners like your listeners, like myself, like yourself, who can guide senior leaders with regards to how to effectively define your company culture, how to ensure that you are leveraging empirical evidence as it pertains to those behavioral standards, and ensuring that you're defining them in a manner that's not only practical, but also applicable and will realize the outcomes that you want. That's part of the work that we do in CultureWorks. But to your point, it's like business leaders have to begin to look at company culture as a strategic pillar to their business. In other words, my company culture is going to exist with or without my active management of it. If I choose not to actively manage it, then I am going to react to the outcomes of it. And if I see my business, my culture as a strategic pillar to my business, then I'm going to invest the time, resources, and materials necessarily to actively build and leverage that pillar in my business. So just like they would hire a subject matter expert, if they're not clear about what's required to implement an asset in their business, to implement a new software program, or to do whatever they believe is necessary to help their business, the same principle applies to actively developing a culture performance management system in their business. Bring the people in who understand what those requirements are. Now, we always say we don't have any ideological view on what the right values are for your business. You have to decide that, and those values should align with your strategic goals and objectives for your business. However, we do argue very clearly in our practice that you should be appropriately defining these core values as it relates to what are the behavioral interactions and outcomes you're looking for. There's an appropriate way to show up and foster trust in an organization, integrity in an organization, accountability in an organization, or whatever core value is important to you. So to your point, we believe that the investment has to be made. So does it require a senior leader's humility or acknowledgement that, you know what, my culture is broken, and more importantly, I don't know how to actively or effectively define it. And I can tell you, every client we work with has arrived at that conclusion, sometimes forcefully, but
Hmm.
they've arrived at, you know what, whatever I'm doing, it isn't working and we need help. So I agree with that notion. I just believe it comes down to that senior leader's acknowledgement and humility around how they drive their business.
Yeah, that's a really great and important point that I think no culture change can start without leaders being willing to acknowledge, as you say, that they lack knowledge, experience, or good ideas on how to address certain issues. And also leaders being willing to go on a growth journey themselves. Because I
You
think
bet.
unless they change, the culture is not going to change either. So that's super important. And obviously, thank you for raising this point of engaging with someone who can support you in that work, right? Whether it's an internal person, I think for some organizations, it simply comes to a point where they decide to hire a people and culture leader who's going to be in charge of that work, or a third party like you and I, or some other culture consultancy. But it's one of those things that you can't really necessarily do yourself, right? It's like, as you say, if you are, and you talk about CPR, by the way, in your book, and I definitely want us to dive into that. But if you have an issue like you can't see and you need new glasses, you are not going to try to figure it out yourself. You will go to a doctor to prescribe you new glasses, right? So you are going to reach out for professional
That's right.
help. And I think it's the same case, absolutely the same case with various culture issues. Let's talk about what's next. So let's say that you've done this work and that you've reached out to someone who can help you out, and you do have that foundation of really clear and really practical guidelines in the form of your core values. And obviously, the reality is not going to be exactly what you have there on paper. So I suppose that a lot of these statements are quite aspirational. So what do you recommend to do next?
To your point around aspirational, I see it as, you have these broader aspirational statements, and then you have true behavioral standards and expectations. And if you've made them practical, that means you've connected them all the way to the leadership level in terms of how individuals connect. Any point of what we call a cultural connection, any point of engagement, interaction, or decision making that occurs over the course of your business. I'm talking day to day.
Can you give us an example to make it
Yeah,
more
absolutely.
specific? An example of a cultural connection behavior? Yeah.
For example, as a leader kicks off their shift for the day, they may start off with a morning huddle or some other connection point where they're pulling other leaders and or subordinates together to level set the objective for the day. That would be an example of a cultural connection. Let's say, another example could be as they're walking the office environment or a production manufacturing environment, for example, and they're walking the production floor. And as they're interacting to check in on progress on a specific production line or progress in a specific department, that is also a cultural connection. Really, any point by which they have developed some management operating system around. So I have my morning huddles, I have my operational meetings, I have my follow ups. Any point of engagement, interaction, or decision making would be considered a cultural connection. Understanding and essentially mapping those cultural connections and then connecting those cultural connections to very intentional practice or exhibiting of the behaviors that embody your core values is essential. Because if I don't understand where I'm actually impacting culture by way of those interactions or decision making, then I don't have a reference point for me to actually trigger the learning and practice around those behaviors, because I can't really refine it proactively unless I first understand where is it happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And I think for a lot of leaders, they are not aware that some of these interactions that they have or decisions that they make, they have cultural implications as well as
Absolutely.
business ones. So it's such a great point, and it's great that you can help your clients to identify what these touch points are. So from your experience in your work with organizations, could you give us an example of how someone has weaved in specific behaviors into these touch points around a specific value?
Oh, absolutely. So, for example, let's say one of our clients' value is trust. And as a core value of trust, one of the behaviors of trust is establishing transparency in communication, transparency in process. So, an example would be they start their morning huddle and they always review performance expectations that include some specific performance metric or KPI results that they expect every hour. And historically, they would share those results and then they would move on to the next topic or point. If they're trying to be more intentional in fostering transparency, one of the steps they would do is revise their huddle to include a couple of more things. They would say, our goal is to establish X widgets as per hour to achieve our production schedule. And that is an increase from the prior day. The reason why it's increased from the prior day is because we had supply chain challenges at another plant that resulted in us having to increase our goals for today. So these are the steps that were taken to fulfill this gap. Something as simple as articulating or incorporating additional details as it relates to just a performance metric, and that's just to start your day, is a subtle and intentional way of adopting the behavior of transparency. Now, that's a really simple one.
Mhm. I appreciate this example, Dante, because I think it helps us understand that these really don't have to be grand gestures. And these are
That's right.
really subtle adjustments that you do in interactions that already exist. So it's not like extra work for anyone. It's just that you engage with your teams in slightly different ways and more intentionally.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for that example. I think that's really important to sort of highlight that it's not doing something extra necessarily. It doesn't have to be grand. It's just tiny tweaks that you do so that you can foster some of the values that perhaps need more attention at the moment in your specific team or in your business unit, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
I love that. That creates a lot of clarity, I think, for us. So as you say, this is the next step. Weave it into all these cultural touch points as much as you can. And then what do you do next? Like, how do you make sure that, to put it bluntly, that everyone follows that and that indeed what the expectation is also common practice in your organization?
Sure. So when we talk about weaving it into the practices, and we see that through both communication and integration, once you've done that effectively and intentionally, and provided some tools or mechanisms to reinforce that, right? So if I've advanced in that example that I gave earlier about a morning huddle, then I've actually established an agenda and a new framework. And you have to create an adoption around that revised approach or being intentional in weaving in those nuances. So while it's simple in those subtle tweaks, you're also talking about human behavior, which means you have to move them from mechanical to conceptual to true ownership around adoption of that new behavior. So that does apply in any adjustment or to your point, tweak that you make to your cultural connection. But now that you've done that, two things need to happen as part of that learning process, or what as we refer to it as the behavioral change process. One, you need to have some point of reference or acknowledgement of how well you actually exhibited that behavior. Now, we've adopted an approach that includes technology as a tool or a resource to provide some visibility. If it's not through leveraging a technology platform like the ones that we offer in our business, it could be through any reference. For example, if I have an agenda that outlines this new approach to my huddle, I may have a subset that says how that this agenda is driving certain core values in the business, be it transparency or some other behavior. So I have a reference
Mm-hmm.
point. I
Mm-hmm.
have to have some self reflection that says, how well did I actually exhibit transparency through how I delivered this message? So you have some point of self reflection. It's like any behavioral change. You have to have a moment that says, acknowledge how well or not so well I did something that resulted in an outcome. So you have that point of self reflection.
So Dante, I want to jump in to help our listeners to understand also your offering and your methodology. So does that mean that the technology that you've developed supports people with that self-reflection, gives them nudges?
Yes,
How does that work?
absolutely. We develop software tools that equip leaders with their development process and more specifically how to better practice the behaviors that align with their company culture. And as part of this software, they're being prompted on specific values that align with their company culture and specific behaviors that they are encouraged to practice in their upcoming cultural connections. And as
Right.
part of those very specific behaviors, after that cultural connection has concluded, because there's a scheduling component to the software will prompt them and have them reflect on how well did you practice transparency
Nice.
during your
Mm.
morning huddle. And it
And you
will allow them,
self-evaluate, right?
yes,
You
it'll allow them
self-evaluate.
to
Hmm.
self evaluate. So that's the self evaluation point because you need some awareness, good, bad, or indifferent, about how well you practice that behavior. Now, the part I left out is that reference point on how to practice the behavior before you enter that cultural connection. Our software provides microburst learning and some tips, just very basic 1 minute, 2 minute learning mechanisms, be it a video, a audio, or text format, but it gives them some best practices. Dante, when you go into your next culture connection to practice transparency, try these things, right? So it gives you a reference point. If you don't have technology, then you would provide some other tools or resources that give you that reference point. Now that you've had that self reflection, the balance of that is feedback. So, just like you've self reflected, you want an opportunity either through solicitation or systematically having some other leader observe how well you practice that behavior. So, in an organization leveraging our software, a leader is prompted saying, Dante is practicing transparency today in his cultural connections. Evaluate him on how well he's practicing his
Oh, I love that.
transparency during that cultural connection so that you get to give feedback
And so you almost get that feedback almost real
real
time
time.
then. So you
Real time.
amazing.
So that allows that development process. So now I have my own self reflection, I have feedback, and oftentimes there's a disparity between what I thought, how well I did, and the feedback I received. And they can leave that not only in scoring, but also in written feedback. Hey, Dante, you really did well in this point. However, you left out why the performance objectives were adjusted. Next time try this, right? So now you have a feedback point. If you think about any sport, anything you may have played, anything you may have learned, the ability for me to actually retain the insight relative to how better to perform a specific task is through both observation, but also through practical hands-on learning and experience. And then I try better the next time. If I want to learn how to swing a bat, it's when my coach came out to the field and showed me my stance, showed me my positioning. Do you feel the difference in how you hold the bat? And then it's also me actually practicing swinging it. Eventually, I'm going to get better at how I swing the bat and how I hit the ball. we take that similar approach. And that's where experiential learning theory comes into play, because we believe through real time reflection, feedback, and then application, you begin to hone those skills as it relates to the behaviors that embody those values. All of this is proactive. You're not waiting a month, a quarter, a year before your employees tell you that the leader has not embodied these behaviors, because then it's almost too late. You may have experienced high turnover or attrition or what have you.
Hmm. Yeah, I love, love, love that. That's absolutely fabulous. And I mean, I wish I had something like that when I was leading a large team in some of the large consultancies that I used to work in the past, because oh my gosh. And I'm also thinking of the, positive side effects of something like that, like creating that growth mindset amongst everyone, because obviously, you are learning in an open space and your colleagues know that you are working on something. So it's absolutely wonderful. And so,
Absolutely.
quick question, something that I still haven't figured out. Like, how do you know as a leader or as a team member who is working on making a positive impact on culture? How do you know what to focus on? How do you identify that, as in your example, transparency should be on my radar because this is something that is needed?
There's two ways of looking at that. Through our software, we believe both in social learning theory and experiential learning theory that, you know, individuals will both experience and observe how others engage, interact, and then essentially you begin to adopt or adapt those similar behaviors. Now, as part of that process, there's only so much an individual can process and retain at any given point. In the book, we speak to the learning styles and learning retention. And what we find is if an organization takes, let's say they have 7 core values, narrow in on the greatest opportunity areas you believe you have in your business, narrow down those values from a practice point of view down to, we always say, the core 4. What are the core 4 values that you believe you have the greatest opportunity? And the best way to know those core 4 areas, one is to leverage the feedback you've already received through your surveys, your town halls, and what have you. And then we also offer some assessment approaches proactively in identifying where those opportunity areas are. So, whatever mechanism you use to identify where those value opportunities are, focus in on those and then systematically appoint a focus area for a week, for a month, for a quarter, depending on how drastic you want to see change in that category, be it accountability, excellence, leadership, whatever it may be. So in our software, we do just that. You select your core 4 that you want to focus in on for the quarter. And then the algorithm, based on the individual's performance across those values, will begin to customize the type of learning material that's being pushed to you and the specific behaviors you're practicing during your cultural connections based on your performance. So there's a quantifiable measurement for how well you are practicing or exhibiting these behaviors based on your self score and the score of a peer or a manager. So you have this real time feedback. Thus, the algorithm is going to say you need to work more on transparency as it relates to trust as a core value because you're not scoring well in that category. Now, let's say you're not leveraging the software, then you're going to leverage some other mechanisms of measurement. And oftentimes that may be something like a pulse survey or something. Now, the key to this, Aga, and this is imperative, part of the flaw in pulsing surveys and in employee experience surveys, the line of questioning doesn't always align with the behaviors that connect to the core values that you're trying to drive through your culture
Totally.
framework.
Totally.
Right. And so
Totally.
why am I asking you the questions that don't connect to how I want my
Yeah.
leaders to show up every day? So that's an
Mm-hmm.
important distinction. If you're going to use surveys as a measurement, you need to ensure that they connect appropriately.
So I want to flesh this out because I think this is new thinking that is still not so broadly applied, I find. And this is one of the things that I do in my own practice as well. So I stopped using culture surveys, although they are wonderful tools and obviously supported by a lot of research. But as you said, the drawback of all these wonderful, well-researched tools is that they haven't been made for you and for your organization. They
That's
have
right.
been made for some sort of an average, healthy culture, whatever it means. But as you say in your book, and as we all know, most of the people who listen to this already know there is no one size that fits all when it comes to culture. And so it only makes sense to measure yourself and baseline yourself against the things that are really important to your organization, not to
Yes,
Microsoft, no, not to Netflix, right? But
that's
for you.
right. That's right. I can't wait to get this recording so I can play it for our clients, Aga, so they can hear it from some another culture geek
I
because
know. It's like, I certainly feel less gaslighted right now, having found you and having spoken to you because it's really not mainstream yet. So for the majority of consultants in our space, they will tell you, well, yes, you need this survey, this culture survey, and it's fantastic. And we've done 30 years of research and we have benchmarks and stuff. And it's all true. And at the same time, very often it's not entirely effective for these organizations. So there's definitely a gap between what we promise and what we can deliver using these tools. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for sort of, I feel validated now. So it's nice to hear that people think or have found similar things in their work. So
absolutely.
I guess, we are slowly running out of time. So I think one last thing that I want to ask you before we move to our next section, which is called rapid fire questions, is if you were to give one last piece of advice to our listeners when it comes to doing something different around, how they approach evolving their culture. What else do we need to know? What else do we need to pay attention to?
Wow, Aga, there's so much. But if I were to
I
give
know
one
it's not
last
a fair question. I do realize, but
if I were to give, one, to your point, piece of advice, I think it's very important for leaders to truly start from the core foundation of their culture, right? Go back to your value systems and first understand, why are these values important to us? How do they help us achieve our strategic goals and objectives as an organization? And as we think about our growth, how will it help carry us into the future? Go back to cultural CPR, breathe some life into it first, understand it before you start to build your system around it. Because oftentimes people they've lost sight to the core values and why they're even important. Are you clear about your purpose, your vision, your mission, and how the practice of these behaviors or core values every day help you fulfill that purpose, vision, and mission, right? So start there as a foundation and then be very intentional about how you implement these behavioral standards and practices in your everyday work, and be very clear about the implications of individuals who don't align with embody. So it's going to those values, because it's going to take some hard conversations and some difficult self-reflection about yourself as a leader as well, because you promote what you permit, and that includes how you show up every day as a leader as well.
you promote what you permit. Yes, truer
That's right.
words have never been spoken. So let's shift gears, Dante, and go to our rapid fire questions. Here's the drift. I'm going to ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and we'll aim at answering these questions, all of them, in under 2 minutes. So it's going to be fast. Okay?
All right.
And the first question is, how do you define organizational culture?
Organizational culture essentially goes back to my earlier definition. Organizational culture represents the language we share, right? The behaviors we exhibit every day, how we engage, how we interact, how we make decisions, and how that impacts our experience in organizations, right? That shared understanding of those values and behaviors that establishes that common language, and the practice of those behaviors, establishing how individuals engage and interact within that company. that's what makes up that culture.
What company, or perhaps companies, do you admire for their culture and why?
I don't know that I have any specific company that I admire for their culture as much as I would say that there are companies out here that we've worked with. I admire their leadership's desire to take a proactive approach and having integrity behind this culture that they claim. They don't just treat it as a marketing exercise or simply responding to consumer interests or supplier interests. They actually believe that embodiment of their core values is imperative for the outcomes of positive outcomes for the business and the experience they're trying to create for their employees, for their customers, for their stakeholders at large. And so I admire any organization who believes in that mindset, that culture is not just a marketing exercise.
Yeah, I love that. I definitely recommend our listeners get a copy of From Culture to Culture. But apart from that, what books on culture or leadership would you recommend?
Any book, when I think about this notion of transformation, I love books like From Good to Great, right? Books that speak to methodologies that leaders can leverage. Anything from James C. Collins, I'm a fan of anyway, so I'm a little biased, but, helping organizations get from point A to point B, like From Good to Great, like From Culture to Culture, are really books that I find interesting because the only constant is change, and transformation, transition is required, or you're are going to slowly die as an organization. So I believe anything that can help leaders get better. I mean, that's the foundation for why I do what I do every day, is to help leaders become better, because being a better leader means you're going to be better in your life personally as much as you are in your organization. So things like From Good to Great, Strength Finders is another book that really, resonates with me in terms of challenging leaders to reflect on foundational strength in how they show up every day as a leader and how they make an impact in an organization.
Yeah. And what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life? I know that you've spoken to this point earlier on, but one little thing that people can do literally tomorrow.
One little thing literally tomorrow is to take, for those organizations who already have their core values established, to take a look at those core values and simply organize a brainstorming session, a reflective session with both leaders and subordinates to talk about those values and understand the impact that those values have on their organization. Because what that will open up is a lot of dialogue around the validity of those values, how well they're already upheld. You can start to discern just through that open discussion about those core values where you may have gaps, and you got to understand where those gaps are. So I would say that that's a step. For those organizations who do not or have not formally defined the values, now is the time to reflect on what has led to your success when you think about how people engage and interact every day, and conduct some open discussion and documentation of those common themes you hear, because what you'll be able to glean from those themes are essentially the makings of those core values that drive your organization's success. So for those that have not established that definition, that's the way to at least start to reflect on those core values in the first place.
Wonderful. So I think in closing, the only thing that I want to ask is, if our listeners want to learn more about you, about your software, what are the best online places to go to?
Yeah, so they can, of course, visit our website at www.getcultureworks, and we spell CultureWorks with an X.
So it's WORX, correct? WORX. Mm-hmm.
X as in xylophone, yes. And why we say X is because we believe culture is truly the X factor that's the market differentiator for you and your business. So getcultureworks.com is a way to visit us. You can go to our LinkedIn page, just search CultureWorks. Again, Culture Works, all one word with an X at the end. You'll find us on LinkedIn. You'll find us on Facebook. We also have a YouTube page where we provide some reinforcements in terms of leadership best practices, cultural performance management best practices as well. So You can visit us anywhere in those three sources. And then I have direct links to my contact and LinkedIn as well at those sources.
Wonderful. So we're going to post all these links in the show notes so our listeners can find them easily.
I also encourage everyone to explore our book, From Culture to Culture, authored by myself and my partner, Randall Powers. We provide details in terms of how to navigate the journey of implementing your culture performance management system. And that includes how to apply very specific practices in your business as you embark upon that journey of defining, implementing, measuring, and improving your company culture.
Thank you so very much for this conversation, Donte. I'm so glad that we got an opportunity to speak and to dive a little bit into what you are doing. I know that we needed probably 4 more hours to go into the details of your approach, but unfortunately we don't have that time. But I do hope that we get an opportunity to bring you back and certainly bring you into our Culture Brained community as well. But thank you so much for today.
So thanks again for having me, Aga.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the CultureLab podcast, and this is the CultureLab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the CultureLab podcast. Donte and I hope that it will inspire you to think broader and deeper about being proactive about your culture and taking a systemic approach to activating and evolving it. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with Donte and other guests of the CultureLab podcast in live sessions where you can learn more on the topics that we discuss on the show, this is just one of many benefits you'd enjoy if you were a member of the Culture Brained community. So, Culture Brained is one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. So if you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a diverse group of culture leaders from Fortune 100 to tiny startups on a rapid growth trajectory. And what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. We are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join us if it feels like the right fit for you. So you can learn more about Culture Brained at tiny.one/culturebrained. That's tiny.one/culturebrained. And you'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the CultureLab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the CultureLab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser. tinyurl.com/Aga Bayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire CultureLab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.